Thank you so much to everyone joining virtually today. My name is Keni Nooner, and I'm Partnerships Manager with Everytown for Gun Safety. I'm honored to be here today to discuss a topic that weighs so heavily on my heart. We're going to be discussing the intersection of guns and violence against the trans community. And while a very somber topic, thanks to the panelists that we have here today, it's also full of hope. I want to start by saying that since the beginning of this movement, it's been led by trans and queer people. And specifically, while we've come a long way for justice and equality, we also know that trans and queer people of color have been disproportionately affected by this movement. And specifically, Black trans women have been the hardest hit by hate and violence, and specifically gun violence. But before we start, we want to take a moment to have just a moment of silence for the trans people that we've lost just this year. Thank you. Now let's meet our panelists. I want everyone to start off by saying who you are, where you're from, what you do, and also what inspires you in the fight for justice for the queer and trans community. Let's start with Aryah.
Hello, I'm Mariah Lester. I am the Deputy Director of the Transgender Strategy Center. I live in Washington, D.C. What inspires me is the live life experiences of trans individuals like myself. My life crossroads have entered a lot of different barriers, such as being homeless 3 times in my life, being unemployed for stints as far as like 2 years. So just thinking about those that still live those types of lives within our community really strives and inspires me to try to be the best that I can and to open up as many doors as possible to others like me.
Thank you, Aryah. Bambi, what about you?
Ah, bueno, primero que nada, a mí me gusta darle gracias a mi poder superior por darme la oportunidad de tener un nuevo día y también honrar la tierra en la que estamos y también honrar la gente que nos acompaña. I know that it was hard for some of you to understand what I just said, but it is something that I am used to doing, honoring my higher power for giving me the opportunity to have one more day to breathe, and also honoring the land where we all stand, and also honoring the beautiful and amazing people who is joining us today to this amazing panel. Um, and I want to say greetings to each and every one. I am so lucky and honored that I get to share space with these beautiful and amazing and incredible individuals. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this platform and this panel and greet the beautiful people all around the world. My name is Bamby Salcedo, and I am the president and the CEO of the TransLatin Coalition. We are a national advocacy organization that also provides direct, supportive, and life saving services in Los Angeles. We are the very first trans led organization in Los Angeles doing this work for our community. And what inspires me to do what I do, I have been doing community work in community for over 20 years. And truly, what inspires me is people um, who I have seen over the years, who I've known young people who are trans, who I've known since they were 12, 13, 15, and now they're 30, and they're leading amazing work and movements. So really young people to me is the light, and to me is who inspire me for me to continue to do what I do. And so I'm very grateful that I get to do what I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bambi. That is truly inspiring. What about you, Everett?
Hi, all. My name is Everett Redente. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, and I do community organizing with Everytown for Gun Safety, supporting Moms Demand Action volunteers out west. I am inspired truly by the resiliency of our community of trans people who find hope and meaning in a world that constantly tells us that we shouldn't exist.
Wow. Finding hope and meaning in a world that tells us that we should not exist. That is truly powerful. Rodrigo, last but not least, what about you?
Hi everyone, I'm Rodrigo Heng-Lehtinen I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the National Center for Transgender Equality. We're a policy and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And I'm really inspired by the power of our activism. There's a lot we have to do, but there's a lot we've already accomplished too. When I came out as trans in 2007, we were having to push and push and push LGBT organizations to do any kind of transgender work at all. Even though the T is in LGBT, it wasn't in a lot of these national advocacy orgs for a very long time. And now things have really changed. That's just a small example, but it's just, as much work as we have still to do, like we have already proven that we're capable of it and that we know what we're doing, and we just got to keep pushing and pushing. So I'm really inspired by how much we've already succeeded, and it just proves that we know what to do. It's just a matter of time until we win.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Rodrigo. So we have a very small amount of time to talk about a subject that, we could probably talk about for forever, but let's just dive in. My first question is a bit broad, but mainly directed, I think I'd say at you, Aryah, excuse me. I'm constantly thinking about the intersection of being Black and the disproportionate effects of gun violence and how I can work in ways to liberate my community. And as a fellow Black woman, I'm curious and I want to know, where do you think we have opportunity for growth or need to build in order to have true liberation for the queer and trans community?
Well, I think when you look at the life of Black transgender women and specifically, there is a lot of places that we actually encounter gun violence, whereas other communities and population may only see it in like one or two places. So we see it from our own fellow Black people, be that in relationships or, in assaults and violence against ourselves and our bodies. We see it from law enforcement as well. And then from law enforcement, you may see it on the point of being either profiled or singled out because of sex work. And then you also see it from being a Black individual. So I think when we look at those intersections of guns and within the life experience of Black transgender women, we can understand just how deeply violence and guns are integrated within the high numbers that we see within our deaths and just the charge that is put out against law enforcement and against justice departments to actually look at us in a kind of a more deeper understanding. I think that there is opportunity for us to really raise the level and make a movement towards gun safety by focusing on those who are most severely affected.
You're right. Thank you for sharing that, Aryah. And I mean, you bring up guns at the intersection, and let's just talk about it. What about as a trans person, let's say, what are some major obstacles you've encountered fighting for violence prevention and gun violence prevention? I would love to start with Bamby, maybe, to answer this question.
Um, I mean, I think, it's evident, right, that the violence that we experience, simply because of who we are, just because our existence really intimidates almost everybody, right? Um, and that in itself, it puts us at a vulnerable position, right? But I think one of the things that is also important to understand is that gun violence and the violence that we experience like correlate with one another, right? And so I think things that need to happen, obviously, it's for us to understand not just our community but just society in general, to understand the position that trans people, transgender, nonconforming, intersex individuals hold within our society, right? And what have been the situations, or, and in this case, right, the institutional violence that have placed us to be where we are in 2020. And now that we have all experienced a global pandemic, right, where trans people are going to be situated, or how trans people are going to be set either further, even further behind than where we were in 2020, right? Rodrigo talked about like the gains that we have gotten. It's true and it's amazing. Many people have contributed to those, right? People who are in this panel and people who are, have done amazing work historically. But unfortunately, you know, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Uh, and there's a lot of infrastructure building that needs to happen, not just within our own community, but also for the broader society to understand what needs to be done in order for us to better the livelihood of our community. Um, and also the interrelation of gun violence and how those portrayed in our lives, and the violence that is portrayed against us simply because of who we are. And I think along with those lines, it's important that we also talk about the criminality of trans people, right? In terms of like, we're targeted and criminalized simply because of who we are, as if who we are is completely wrong. And my dear sibling Everett said, that society thinks that we're not supposed to exist yet. For generations, we have been here, and we are here, and we will continue to be here. But how do we better the livelihood and the conditions of living of trans and gender nonconforming people?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's important to note that, the intersection there is very strong. And you mentioned the criminality and the hate against trans people. We know that guns don't cause hate violence, but we know that guns make hate violence more deadly. As advocates looking to you, Everett, how can we ensure that gun violence prevention work we're doing includes and protects the trans community?
Yeah, these issues are one and the same. Like, there's a staggering connection between gun violence and violence against trans people. We know that 74% of trans and gender nonconforming people who were murdered in the United States in the past few years were murdered by a gun. There's a fundamental problem with how we sometimes approach this work. We either have organizations that specialize in single issues or specialize in serving the trans community, but rarely both. So we need single issue organizations, like one centered on gun violence prevention, for example, to include and center Black trans femmes and women in their work. There's a couple ways that we can do this, just a few examples. One, we need to hire and support trans staff, not just when we hire them, but throughout their tenure with an organization. So it's not like they're in there and feel completely unsupported once they're in. And two, we need to partner with trans-led organizations and pay them for that work. We in the gun violence prevention space need to actually hold ourselves accountable to doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I love how you framed that. It's such an important thing to point out. I mean, we need to hold ourselves accountable and make sure that we are including everyone who's affected into this conversation, and frankly, just everyone in general, and making sure that we're all fighting for this toward this equality. And speaking of equality, we're going through a moment right now that everyone is dealing with, in sort of an outcry about police violence against the Black community and also the trans community as well. And let's talk about the police. As a country, we're having these conversations more than ever, and Black people are suffering. And what conversations do we need to have about the impact of policing on Black trans people? I want a lot of people on this call to answer this question if you have an answer, but I want to start with Aryah on this question.
Well, I've been tackling that on many different fronts. One, I do contract with the Department of Justice, and I worked with them on their inaugural first time law enforcement in the transgender community, where we bring different precincts, FBI agents, CIA agents, and bring them together in a room with trans individuals who can train them on true, organic, deep cultural competency, and not only on the level of just understanding what it means to be trans, but understanding what it means for you to be a police officer and for trans individuals and gender nonconforming individuals to have certain things put up against them that are stereotypical, that lead to a lot of the violence that we get from law enforcement. And then it's also kind of nurturing the community and understanding what their rights are, not only their rights, but where their power is, and really being able to put pressure on law enforcement on different precincts and pressure on cold cases that need to be reopened for some of our murders. And then when you look through the justice side, it is actually getting the long-term convictions on those who do occur violence on our lives as we move about, to get the highest sentences out there so that there is kind of a price to be paid in taking away a trans life, where currently it seems that is an easy thing for Americans to do without consequence when you really look at it. So it's empowering the community. It's actually working with law enforcement, and is building up the power of civilians and having civilian review boards that can pressure law enforcement agencies.
Yeah. Bamby, I noticed you talked about policing a little bit earlier. I wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way that we're going to, I like to rephrase or frame as culture transformation, right? It's going to have to be multidimensional and approach in many different ways, right? Many members of our community, I myself, I'm part of the people's budget here in the city of Los Angeles, right? And what is happening now, and what we have been saying all along for many, many years, is that instead of investing in arming the police, right, and really creating this system of oppression against all of our communities, right? We want to divest, to defund the police, right? Like, they don't need tanks, policing our streets, right? They don't need, you know, all of those things that they get, right? With all the money that they get billions of dollars in funding, even like in each city, right? Or each major city. Um, what we need is to really empower people, and being able to receive the basic and needed services, right? Like those social supportive services that empowers us, for us to be healthy individuals, for us to be able to thrive, right? And it's the same for trans people. All of our organizations, I know that for us, when we decided to also be a service providing agency, was because our community was not having access to those basic needs, right? Like housing, food, right? Like just basic necessities that people need to have. And that's what needs to happen, right? We know that Black people, people of color, Latinos and Blacks, obviously are the ones who uh, make the vast population who are incarcerated, right? And it's the same how we are being targeted as being trans, right? We know that many of us walking down the street, we're stopped by the police because of this, like, prejudice that we are doing sex work when we're actually going to get milk to the store or something, right? Um, and so, like, we need to like really invest in communities, and that's what we all want. We all have tried for many years. I know that I have worked with the Department of Justice. I have worked with multiple police enforcement agencies, and the institution continues to be the same. So there's something radical that needs to happen, and what we want, it really is to use the feminist lens to really transform the culture of the police, and through supporting our community directly, it's one of the ways that we're going to be able to empower our communities, but also transform the culture that has been built that continues to marginalize us for centuries.
Yeah. And lack of resources is a huge, I think, obstacle for many reasons as to why different communities are disproportionately affected by these issues. I think one of the obstacles that we also face when we try to find solutions for this, right, to gun violence against trans people, is a lack of awareness and a lack of research on this crisis. And one of the things that I'm curious to know is, why isn't anti-trans violence breaking through to the mainstream audiences? I mean, we hear about it every now and then. We don't always get the full report or understand what actually happened to people. And what role, do we think that the media is playing in elevating this issue, or how are we having this lack of awareness? Rodrigo, I'd love to hear from you on this one, since I know that your organization really focuses on this sort of thing.
Sure. Well, one of the big issues that we face is that the media and law enforcement agencies keep getting violence against trans people wrong. There's a lot of layers to this. One thing is that oftentimes police officers will simply rely on the name that's on someone's driver's license or state ID, when that might very well not be the name that the person uses every day. I mean, I'm transgender and I go by Rodrigo, and that's my legal name now, but there were many years where I was going by Rodrigo every day. It's the name that everyone knew me by, and it was not the name on my ID, because updating your ID can be very expensive. It can cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It can require a letter from a doctor, and we know that a lot of trans people experience discrimination when trying to access healthcare. I mean, there's just so many reasons why people might not have updated their IDs. So then you have police officers who are just simply rely on the name there, do not investigate thoroughly or in a way that's at all sensitive. Like Aryah said, there's so much just like dismissiveness, and there's all these cold cases, and violence against us is just not taken seriously by police, let alone not even getting into the fact that police officers often perpetuate this violence themselves. So anyway, then what happens is the media replicates all of that harm. A lot of times then journalists will run a story not using the person's name, which may sound like a small thing, but is really about treating someone with respect and really just honoring someone's memory. So journalists should really take the extra step to confirm, was this person trans? Was this the name that they actually used? Get in touch with people who actually know the person. Another issue we see is that journalists will say, well, I heard a rumor that this person went by another name, but their parents wouldn't confirm it. I mean, a lot of transgender people face rejection from our families. There's absolutely no guarantee at all that your blood relative is going to be the one who actually knows what name your friends knew you by. So, one thing is just that journalists have to take the extra time to get the story right and actually confirm if someone was trans, and honor the validity of friendships, and not just dismiss friendships as, well, it's just some person who knew them, but the parents can't confirm, so it doesn't matter. A lot of times our friends are our family. They're the ones who really know us best. And journalists need to take those sources seriously to then report our stories in ways that are respectful and affirming. And then another issue is that, honestly, journalists need to cover stories about us when we're alive, too. Getting the story right when we die is still not going to be enough. We need our neighbors to see us as full-fledged, well-rounded human beings. And that's not going to happen if journalists wait until there's a homicide to tell our stories. So as important as it is to raise awareness about these homicides, we also need the public perception, the public to see us as full human beings prior to a crime like this being committed. And the media has a big job to do in that respect.
Okay. And so I heard the media. I'm curious to know if anyone else has more thoughts on this piece about showing the trans community as more human, because even Everett mentioned it earlier about, being in a world where we're not seen as human. How can trans people, or the world, and not put this burden on trans people, but how can the world be more accommodating to treating human people as humans? And I know that sounds so simple, but I'm wondering if there are other ways outside of the media that we can work together, that allies can work together to do that.
I think that it's exactly what you said, not burdening trans individuals, because trans individuals were not the ones who created these negative narratives for ourselves. It's media and other people outside of our communities that have created this. When you look at like the talk show circuit in the 90s or the 80s into the 90s, and how that crafted a narrative around trans people tricking, individuals, and trans people being the lowest of the low when you look at the social ladder. So I think it's about education. I think it's about educating yourselves as allies, as people outside of our circles, and then taking that education and spreading it. Just the topic alone is a taboo topic, at the kitchen dinner table. And it should not be, because gender, one, has nothing to do with sexuality. This is a conversation that we can have with our children when they are young, when they're able to understand words, is when we can talk about gender, because we talk about gender roles to them and what is expected of them because of their birth sex. And so we need to talk about what it means to be transgender outside of the stereotypes that have been pushed for so many decades.
That's so important, Aryah. I think in order to understand a problem or to solve it, you actually have to understand it, right? So, Everett, from a gun violence perspective, what data and research are we missing around this?
I really think Rodrigo and Aryah hit some of the really important pieces. But thinking from a gun violence prevention perspective, right now, we only know when a trans person is killed if the media happens to report on it, and the police, again, and if they happen to get the victim's gender identity and name correctly. And oftentimes that comes with advocacy of grieving, community members. It often comes back on trans people to advocate and say, hey, this is my friend, and this is actually the name that they went by. So we're seeing a lot of that. We need better reporting of these murders, and we need police and media to stop dead naming and misgendering these victims. We also need mandatory reporting of these crimes. So currently, law enforcement agencies are not mandated to report hate crime data to the FBI. So if we're going to exist in a world that has law enforcement, these numbers there are huge gaps. Some entire states have 0 hate crimes reported every year, and we know that that's not true. Other than homicides, we know almost nothing about how trans people experience gun violence. Trans people need to be included in research being done on gun violence across the board, but also research in general to get that full picture spectrum of our lives.
And that research needs to be trauma informed as well. I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and by trauma informed, just for our listeners, what do you mean, Aryah?
Well, I myself, I've had times where guns were pulled out on me, with from people in the street, and there was a time when law enforcement pulled out guns on me as well. And so when we're looking at having people recount traumatic experiences, it's one, in order to make a safe space for that person, not only to give you that data, but a safe mental space to actually go through those emotions. Because a lot of us deal with PTSD because of our lived life experiences as trans and gender nonconforming individuals, especially us Latinas and Black women, within the transgender spectrum, because we're seeing most of that violence put against our bodies. So you need to have a mental approach when it comes to assessing and collecting data from trans communities from traumatic experiences.
Yeah, that empathy piece I think is very key, and thinking about how we approach this issue and making sure also once again bringing it back to the human or the humanity piece of it all. I think that's a really good key. So thank you for noting that, Aryah. Very nicely put. Thank you to everyone. Really, I think I want to start moving this to sort of a closeout, but we talked a lot today, and I think it's important for everyone watching to keep this conversation going and to take action, really. So I want to ask everyone on this call, particularly for cisgender people who want to join the fight, what would it be? What would you say they should do? And I'm going to start with Rodrigo on this one.
Well, one thing that's really important is to engage in all these other attacks that the Trump administration is perpetuating to put trans people in harm's way. So for example, any day now, probably in another week or so, the Trump administration under the Housing and Urban Development, HUD, is about to drop a rule that would allow homeless shelters to turn transgender people away. And keep in mind, they're doing this in the middle of a pandemic and a recession in our economy when people need housing and shelters more than ever. And the Trump administration is trying to let shelters turn people away. That might sound disconnected from the issue of violence, but the thing is that when people in our community are pushed into desperate circumstances, that's when you're even more vulnerable to violence. If you can't have a roof over your head and you have to sleep outside, you're in a much riskier situation, and no one should have to do that. So, I'd really encourage us to connect the dots on all these issues to protect trans people and protect our community from being in such vulnerable situations to begin with. And one way to do that on this HUD issue in particular is you can go to housingsaveslives.org. So again, that's housingsaveslives.org. You can sign up there. We will email you when the public comment period starts so that you can write your comment. It's like sending an email to protest against this rule. If we apply enough pressure, we can keep the Trump administration from going through with this so that emergency shelters and housing shelters have to keep supporting and affirming trans people. Now, there's a lot more else we need to do to make shelters more accessible to begin with. They're not perfect, but we know that allowing shelters a license to discriminate, to turn people away altogether, would be even more devastating. So again, I just say housingsaveslives.org. It's a good place to start.
Thank you for pointing out that intersection, Rodrigo. I hope everyone will take that call to action. I'm going to move over to Everett, particularly for cisgender people. What would be your call to action to join the fight?
I have two quick things. First and foremost, I would say to donate directly to Black trans folks and Black trans-led organizations. This will provide direct relief, and people have the autonomy to choose where they want those funds to go to in their lives, where it will have the most impact. And second, if folks are interested in getting more involved in gun violence prevention, take the first step and text PRIDE to 64433 to get signed up.
Amazing. Bambi, what would be your call to action? Oh no, I can't hear.
My apologies.
Okay.
My call to action to all of these beautiful and amazing people who are watching this session is a couple of things. One, um, that it is important that you understand your power as an individual, but also that we all understand the power that we have collectively, and that we can obviously transform the way society has seen us for centuries, right? I want to really encourage people to unapologetically be who they are and really demand what is righteous yours, right? Um, and really, just be radical if you have to, right? Because a lot of people are very conformist, and a lot of people, just go with the flow basically, and the standard has not worked for us and will not work for us if we don't empower ourselves. So I hope that all of you do understand that we do have power, and it doesn't matter if the Trump administration is trying to erase us, right? We will always be here, but we have to obviously be strategic, and we have to organize, and we have to claim and demand what is rightfully ours in our society. So I invite you to really hold your power in space anywhere and everywhere you walk. Thank you.
I love that. Uh, Aryah, what would be your call to action?
My call to action would be first, make us an everyday conversation. Make trans individuals, gender nonconforming individuals in their lives an everyday conversation with your families, with your friends. And you might think like, whoa, that's too much, but look at the conversations now with Black Lives Matter and so many non-Black people, white people finally speaking out, saying, well, I've been silent this whole time, but now I have to speak out about it. I can't be afraid just because I don't know what to say to not say anything. And that's what's needed for trans lives right now. We need to be normalized, because we are people and we are normal people. So we need to have those conversations on a day-to-day basis. And we need for other individuals, allies or so-called accomplices, that it would be better to leverage your privilege. All of us have privileges. Trans people have less than any other person. So take whatever privilege you have, assess yourself, find out what that privilege is, and then utilize that privilege in order to leverage communities like trans individuals.
Yes, and you guys have said some really amazing things. And honestly, when I was listening to Bambi, I was inspired and actually sparked one of my last questions that I think would be really great for us to close out on, because this is obviously for New York City Pride. I want to know, what's everyone doing for Pride this year? I mean, we have to shelter in place. I would love to know what your plans are. I'm going to start with Everett.
I am working on continuing my advocacy work and reaching as many folks as I can in the networks that I have, and leveraging the privilege and space that I do have, keeping in mind that I am an immunocompromised person and I am limiting my contact, still living in multiple pandemics right now.
Thanks so much, Everett. What about you, Rodrigo?
Well, similar to Everett, I mean, I'm really leaning into all these digital tools. It's funny, at first it seemed like, oh, Pride events are canceled. But I think as we started realizing all of the potential to organize digitally, it's really inspired me. I mean, I think ironically, I'm actually able to participate in more Pride spaces like this now. And before we had as many digital options like this, and when we were relying on in-person events, a lot of times prides were, at least were in the cities I happen to live, they were in neighborhoods that were hard to get to, or there wasn't good public transit, or it was huge crowds, and I know people in wheelchairs struggled for accessibility. So I'm really thinking a lot about how we can use digital tools to make things more accessible. It's not perfect. There's a lot of things we have to improve upon, but I just think there's a lot of potential there. So I'm really excited to figure out how we can make Pride actually even more accessible than it used to be, with all of our creativity.
Yeah, I love that. Pride everywhere. Bambi, any plans for Pride this year?
Well, so for me, Pride is Pride plans for Pride this year. Um, I think for me, I don't necessarily believe in pride. I think that all of us should be proud of who we are every single day, right? And not just one day or one month, right? And so um, for me, pride is just, Pride Month, I guess, it's sort of like an excuse to celebrate and people get drunk and all of that. Like typically now it's different because of what we're experiencing, which is, cool in some ways. But I think, you know, pride has sort of like non pride has evolved to be what it wasn't intended to be in the first place, right? And I'm really glad that the uprising is happening right now because it's up, it's happening in June when it's supposed to be like Pride, right? Um, but Pride really started as as an uprising of the marginalization of the LGBTQ community. So for me, I learned to be proud, right? I learned to be uh, not ashamed of who I am, and I think if we learn to do that, we can celebrate every single day ourselves in our community. And I don't need June for it to be Pride. I can celebrate my people every single day. So Pride is just it's a capitalistic way of profiting from our people also.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, after people hear this panel and really think about it, they'll start to become better advocates and more intentional advocates for the queer and trans community. Aryah, last but not least, what are your plans for Pride?
Well, I agree with Bambi. I'll be remiss as board chair for STAR, the organization that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera created in 1970. The first Pride was a riot, and that's what Pride should be about. We have to celebrate our pride in ourselves, like Bambi said, on an everyday basis. But during this time where we have like kind of a national and a global lens in our community, it is an opportunity for us to be loud about the atrocities that we are inflicted within our communities, LGBTQ and of color alike. And for me, I'm actually happy to have a virtual Pride because I get anxiety around big crowds, i.e., just rewind this whole conversation to see why. And so I think that these virtual platforms are a breath of fresh air, and I am grateful for it. And continue to be proud in your writing, be proud in vocalizing our issues, and be proud in taking a stand to ensure that everyone sees us as human beings.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully said, and honestly, a great way for us to end. I am honored to have been in this space with you all. Thank you for actually just giving me a moment to get educated, and everyone who's watching this right now. hopefully people will walk away with something or feeling that they have some hope on how they can create a change within the queer and trans community. And overall, I really just want to thank you guys for your time, your courage, and your power. And I really am excited to continue working with you and hope that we will cross in different spaces again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Thank you all so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah. Well, we got you on video.
Thank you for
Yeah, the video worked.
Oh.